when tech billionaire Meridith Kavari stormed into St. Cassian's Basilica, demanding God prove his existence, no one expected the series of inexplicable events that would shake their small town to its very core. What happened next would not only challenge everything she believed in, but would leave even the most hardened skeptics questioning their reality. This is the story that's leaving millions speechless, and today, you're about to discover why. Before we dive into this extraordinary tale, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss the powerful message this story carries, and trust me, the ending will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about faith and science. The ancient bells of St. Cassian's Basilica echoed through the misty valleys of Lunaris Grove, their deep, resonant tones carrying across the town's cobblestone streets and weathered slate roofs. Perched atop Aurora Heights, the basilica's gothic spires pierced the twilight sky like ancient sentinels, their shadows stretching across Moonweaver Square as the sun dipped below the horizon. Lunaris Grove wasn't just any small town tucked away in the mountains. It was a place where time seemed to move differently, where the modern world's chaotic pulse slowed to match the rhythmic chiming of the church bells. The locals took pride in their traditions, in the way morning fog would dance around the whispering path, and how the sweet scent of fresh bread from Vesper Quinn's bakery would mingle with the fragrant roses in celestial gardens. Father Ambrose Thaddeus stood at the basilica's ornate entrance, his weathered hands folded in front of his traditional cassock as he greeted the evening mass attendees. At 68, his face carried the gentle wrinkles of someone who had spent a lifetime smiling, though his eyes held a depth of wisdom that spoke of both joy and sorrow. He had served this community for over 3 decades, becoming as much a part of Lunaris Grove as the ancient stones of St. Cassian's itself. Beside him stood Soren Devereux, a young man whose presence seemed to bridge the gap between the old world and the new. At 28, Soren had found his way to Lunaris Grove 3 years ago, seeking refuge from a past that still haunted his dreams. Father Ambrose had taken him in without question, offering him not just a job as the basilica's caretaker, but also a chance at redemption. The evening air carried a peculiar electricity, an unusual tension that seemed to whisper of approaching change. Elisara Pendry, the town's eldest resident at 92, paused at the church steps, her wise eyes scanning the darkening sky. "Something's different tonight, Father," she murmured, her voice carrying the weight of years of observation. "The air feels like it does before a storm." Father Ambrose nodded, understanding in his eyes. Elisara had always been sensitive to the subtle shifts in their small town's atmosphere. "Perhaps we're about to witness something extraordinary, Elisara," he replied softly, helping her up the worn stone steps. None of them could have known just how prophetic those words would prove to be. The first sign that this evening would be different came with the distant sound of an engine. Not the familiar putt-putt of local cars, but the aggressive purr of precision-engineered German machinery. Heads turned as a sleek matte black Mercedes AMG GT rolled down the whispering path, its presence as alien in Lunaris Grove as a spaceship would have been. The car came to a stop in Moonweaver Square, its darkened windows reflecting the last rays of sunset. When the driver's door opened, Meridith Kavari emerged like a vision from another world. Her tailored black suit probably cost more than what most locals earned in months, and her platinum hair was pulled back in a severe style that emphasized her sharp cheekbones and penetrating gray eyes. At 42, Meridith Kavari had built an empire from nothing, turning a small tech startup into Kavari Tech, a global giant in artificial intelligence and quantum computing. Her net worth was estimated in the billions, and her name regularly appeared in headlines alongside other tech visionaries. But it wasn't her wealth or success that had brought her to Lunaris Grove. It was something far more personal, a mission born from years of pain and anger. As she strode toward St. Cassian's, her Louboutin heels clicking against ancient cobblestones, the usual evening chatter died away. Even those who didn't recognize her could sense something momentous was about to unfold. The tension in her stride, the determination in her eyes, everything about her screamed of someone prepared to wage war. Dr. Callista Reeves, watching from the steps where she had been chatting with Father Ambrose, felt her medical instincts kick in. After 20 years of practicing medicine, she had developed a sixth sense for approaching storms, both meteorological and emotional. Something in Meridith's bearing reminded her of patients just before they received life-changing diagnoses, a mixture of fear, anger, and desperate determination. As Meridith reached the church steps, her eyes locked with Father Ambrose's. For a moment, time seemed to stand still, two worlds colliding in silent confrontation. The ancient faith of Lunaris Grove meeting the cold logic of Silicon Valley's finest. Father Ambrose Thaddeus, I presume. Her voice cut through the evening air like a blade of ice. I believe you and I have an appointment with truth tonight. The gathering crowd held its collective breath, sensing they were about to witness something that would change their peaceful town forever. No one could have predicted just how right they were, or how the events about to unfold would challenge everything they thought they knew about faith, science, and the thin line between coincidence and miracle. The interior of St. Cassian's Basilica held the kind of silence that seemed to vibrate with centuries of prayers and whispered confessions. Ancient wooden pews, polished to a soft gleam by generations of faithful, stretched in perfect rows toward the magnificent altar. Stained glass windows cast jewel-toned shadows across the stone floor, their biblical scenes seemingly coming to life in the flickering light of hundreds of votive candles. Meridith Kavari's entrance shattered this sacred quiet like a stone through stained glass. Her footsteps echoed off the vaulted ceiling as she strode down the central aisle, each click of her heels a deliberate disruption of the peace. The evening mass congregants turned in their seats, a wave of whispers rippling through the basilica as they recognized the famous tech billionaire whose face had graced countless magazine covers. Father Ambrose stood at the altar, his weathered hands resting gently on the ancient wood. Despite the tension crackling through the air, his expression remained serene, though his eyes carried a weight of concern as he watched Meridith approach. Beside him, Soren Devereaux shifted uneasily, his hands unconsciously clenching into fists at his sides. I have to admit, Meridith's voice carried clearly through the vast space, each word precise and cutting. This is quite the theatrical setting you've created here. The architecture, the lighting, the atmosphere. It's all designed to evoke an emotional response, isn't it? To make people feel small and desperate for something bigger than themselves? She stopped halfway down the aisle, her gray eyes scanning the faces around her. Some parishioners looked away, uncomfortable with the confrontation, while others met her gaze with a mixture of curiosity and defiance. Vesper Quinn, who had closed her bakery early for evening mass, clutched her rosary tighter, its wooden beads clicking softly in the tense silence. Ms. Kavari. Father Ambrose's voice was gentle but firm, carrying the kind of authority that came from decades of shepherding souls. Everyone is welcome in God's house, but I sense you haven't come here seeking solace or community. A sharp laugh escaped Meridith's lips, the sound bouncing off the ancient stones like breaking glass. Solace? Community? No, Father Ambrose, I've come here for something far more important. I've come for truth. She took another step forward, her presence commanding attention even in the vast space of the basilica. You see, I've spent my life building systems that run on pure logic, on verifiable data and measurable outcomes. My algorithms have revolutionized everything from medical diagnosis to climate prediction. They work because they're based on facts, not faith. Dr. Callista Reeves, sitting in the front pew, found herself leaning forward despite her reservations. As a physician, she understood the allure of pure science, of measurable results and evidence-based conclusions. But she had also witnessed things in her practice that defied logical explanation. Recoveries that shouldn't have been possible, moments of insight that seemed to come from somewhere beyond rational thought. And yet, Meridith continued, her voice taking on an edge of barely contained anger. Here you stand, in this monument to mythology, telling people to put their trust in something they can't see, can't measure, can't verify. Do you have any idea how many lives have been destroyed by this kind of blind faith? Father Ambrose descended the altar steps slowly, his movements deliberate and calm. Soren made to follow him, but the priest raised a hand, signaling him to stay back. Faith isn't blind, Miss Kavari. It's a different kind of vision, one that sees beyond what can be measured in a laboratory or computed by an algorithm. Convenient. Meridith's smile was razor sharp. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. When you can't prove something, you simply claim it exists beyond proof. But I'm not here to debate philosophy, Father. I'm here to issue a challenge. A murmur ran through the congregation. Elisera Pendry, who had witnessed over 9 decades of life in Lunaris Grove, felt her breath catch. There was something familiar in Meridith's pain, something she recognized from her own past struggles with faith. Your God, Meridith's voice rose, filling the Basilica with her challenge. If he exists, has exactly 1 week to prove himself to me. Not through convenient coincidences or emotional manipulation, but through something that even my most advanced algorithms can't explain. She reached into her designer briefcase and withdrew a thick envelope, holding it up for all to see. In this envelope is a certified check for $50 million. If your God can prove his existence to me, through any means that can't be explained by science or probability, this money will go to your church and the community of Lunaris Grove. The congregation erupted in whispers. $50 million could transform their small town, repair the aging basilica, fund the community programs that had been struggling for years. But the price, challenging God himself, seemed too high, too dangerous. And if you don't see this proof? Father Ambrose asked quietly, though his voice carried clearly through the murmuring crowd. Meridith's smile grew colder. Then I'll buy this basilica and turn it into a technology education center. These stones can serve a better purpose than hosting fairy tales and false hopes. Soren stepped forward, unable to contain himself any longer. You can't just walk in here and... I can and I am. Meridith cut him off sharply. Your God has 7 days. 7 days to prove he's more than a story people tell themselves to feel better about their insignificance. She turned to address the congregation directly, her voice carrying a mix of challenge and barely concealed pain. I've spent my life building things that actually help people, creating technologies that save lives and solve real problems. Where was your God when my sister was dying of cancer? Where was he when the best medical minds in the world, using my AI diagnostic systems, couldn't save her? The Basilica fell silent at this revelation, the personal pain behind her challenge suddenly clear to everyone present. Even Soren, who had been bristling with anger at her audacity, felt a twinge of empathy. He knew what it was like to question God in the face of personal tragedy. Father Ambrose studied Meridith for a long moment, his eyes filled with compassion rather than judgment. Finally, he spoke, his voice gentle but unwavering. We accept your challenge, Ms. Kavari. Not because we need to prove God's existence, but because you need to find peace. 7 days from now. Same time, same place. Meridith placed the envelope on the nearest pew, her movements precise and controlled. 7 days, Father. Time to see if faith can stand up to facts. As she turned and walked back down the aisle, her heels echoing through the stunned silence, the setting sun broke through the western windows, sending shafts of light through the stained glass. For just a moment, these beams caught her platinum hair, creating what looked like a halo around her head, an irony that wasn't lost on those watching her departure. After she left, the Basilica remained silent for several long moments. Finally, Elisera Pendry's aged voice broke the quiet. Well, Father Ambrose, it seems Lunaris Grove is about to witness either a miracle or a tragedy. Father Ambrose looked at the envelope sitting on the pew, then at the crucifix hanging above the altar. Perhaps, Elisera, it will be both. God works in mysterious ways, and sometimes the greatest miracles start with the deepest doubts. As the congregation slowly began to disperse, whispering among themselves about what they had witnessed, Soren approached Father Ambrose. What are we going to do? The priest smiled gently, placing a hand on the young man's shoulder. We're going to pray, Soren, and then we're going to watch God work in ways that even the most advanced algorithm could never predict. The challenge had been issued, the stakes set. In 7 days, the peaceful world of Lunaris Grove would either witness a miracle that would shake a skeptic's certainty, or see its sacred heart transformed by the very technology its challenger wielded like a sword. Either way, nothing in their small town would ever be quite the same again. The morning after her dramatic challenge at St. Cassian's, Meridith Kavari stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her rented penthouse suite at Lunaris Grove's only luxury hotel. Below her, the town was waking up, its ancient rhythms unchanged despite the storm she had unleashed the previous evening. The sun painted the misty valleys in shades of gold, a sight that would have been beautiful if she allowed herself to see it as anything more than a predictable result of atmospheric conditions and light refraction. Her tablet displayed the morning's headlines: Tech Billionaire Challenges God, Kavari Tech CEO's Divine Deadline, Silicon Valley Meets Sacred Valley. The story had already gone viral, exactly as she had calculated it would. Meridith took a sip of her perfectly prepared espresso, her free hand unconsciously moving to touch the pendant hidden beneath her silk blouse, the last gift her sister Elena had given her. A soft chime from her tablet announced an incoming video call. The familiar face of her chief of staff, Marcus, appeared on the screen. Meridith, the board is concerned. Taking on organized religion isn't exactly great for shareholder value. The board is always concerned, Marcus, she replied coolly. Remind them that my personal actions have nothing to do with Kavari Tech's operations. Besides, her lips curved in a slight smile, controversy creates opportunity. Our AI ethics initiative will look even more progressive after this. But as she ended the call, the carefully constructed walls of her professional persona began to crack. Her eyes drifted to the worn leather journal sitting on the nearby desk. Elena's journal. She had read it countless times since her sister's death 2 years ago, trying to understand how someone so brilliant, so logical, could have turned to faith in her final days. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Opening it, she found Soren Devereaux standing in the hallway, his tall frame somehow making the luxurious corridor seem small. "Ms. Kavari," he said, his voice carrying none of the previous evening's anger. "Father Ambrose would like to speak with you. Not about the challenge," he added quickly, seeing her expression harden. "He just wants to talk." Meridith's first instinct was to refuse, but something in Soren's demeanor gave her pause. Unlike the previous night, there was no hostility in his eyes, only a deep understanding that made her uncomfortable. "Fine," she said finally. "Tell him to meet me at the cafe in Moonweaver Square in an hour." After Soren left, Meridith changed into a casual yet impeccably tailored pantsuit, her armor against the world. As she made her way through the town's narrow streets, she could feel the stares of the locals, could hear their whispers. She was used to attention, but this felt different, less about awe or envy, more about judgment and curiosity. The cafe, a charming establishment called the Morning Star, was already busy when she arrived. Vesper Quinn, who owned both this cafe and the bakery, nearly dropped a tray of pastries when Meridith walked in. Father Ambrose was already there, seated at a quiet corner table, his traditional black cassock standing out among the morning crowd. "Ms. Kavari?" He stood as she approached, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. "Thank you for coming." Meridith sat down, her posture perfect, defensive. "I assume this is where you try to save my soul, Father?" The priest's smile was gentle but knowing. "Actually, I thought we might talk about Elena." The name hit Meridith like a physical blow. She hadn't expected him to know about her sister, hadn't prepared for this angle of attack. "How do you know about your sister?" Father Ambrose finished softly. "I make it a point to understand those who challenge God so dramatically. Elena Kavari, brilliant quantum physicist, graduated MIT at 19, diagnosed with aggressive lymphoma at 32. She spent her last month searching for something beyond equations and probabilities." Meridith's hands clenched around her coffee cup. She was confused, scared. The cancer had spread to her brain. She wasn't thinking clearly. Was she? Father Ambrose asked gently. Or was she finally seeing clearly for the first time? The memory crashed over Meridith with unexpected force. Elena in her hospital room, surrounded by the best medical equipment money could buy, holding her hand and speaking with an enthusiasm Meridith hadn't seen since before the diagnosis. "Mary," Elena had said, using the childhood nickname that only she was allowed to use, "I've found something amazing. All these years we've been looking at the universe wrong. The mathematics, the quantum mechanics, they're not disproving God, they're revealing him. The deeper we go, the more miraculous it all becomes." "It was the medication," Meridith said sharply, pulling herself back to the present. The pain management cocktail was affecting her judgment. Father Ambrose sat back, studying her with those penetrating eyes that seemed to see too much. "Is that why you kept her journal? Because you dismissed her final insights as drug-induced delusions?" Meridith stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. Several cafe patrons turned to look, but she barely noticed. "You don't know anything about my sister or me. This conversation is over." But as she turned to leave, Father Ambrose spoke again, his voice carrying clearly in the suddenly quiet cafe. "Elena came to understand something you haven't yet, Ms. Kavari. That faith and reason aren't enemies. They're two wings of the same bird. Without both, we cannot truly soar." Meridith paused, her back still turned to the priest. "My sister was a scientist. She believed in facts, in proof. And in her final months, she found the greatest proof of all, that some truths can only be measured by the heart." Something inside Meridith threatened to break, a dam of grief and anger she had held back for 2 years. Without turning around, she said quietly, "Your God took the most brilliant mind I've ever known and turned it toward fairy tales. He doesn't need to prove himself to me, Father. He needs to answer for what he's done." As she walked out of the cafe, the morning sun caught her tears, turning them into brief prisms of light before she quickly wiped them away. Behind her, Father Ambrose watched her go, his heart heavy with understanding. He had seen this before, the way tragedy could build walls around a heart, how pain could blind someone to the very comfort they needed most. Soren, who had been quietly observing from another table, approached Father Ambrose. "She's running from something more than doubt, isn't she?" The priest nodded slowly. "She's running from love, Soren. The kind of love that persists beyond death, that challenges our carefully constructed barriers. Elena found that love in her final days. And that, more than anything, is what terrifies her sister." Outside, Meridith walked quickly through Moonweaver Square, her professional mask firmly back in place, but her hand kept straying to Elena's pendant, and in her mind she could hear her sister's voice from the journal she had memorized. "The miracle, Mary, isn't in the denial of science, but in the realization that science itself points to something greater. Every equation, every quantum leap, every synchronized moment in the cosmos whispers of a design beyond our comprehension. I wish you could see it, sister. I wish you could feel what I feel now." The morning breeze carried the sound of St. Cassian's bells, their tones somehow both mournful and hopeful. 6 days remained in Meridith's challenge, but the real test had nothing to do with proof or probability. It was about a heart locked in grief, and whether it could open enough to see what Elena had discovered in her final days, that sometimes the greatest mysteries of life lie not in what we can prove, but in what we allow ourselves to believe. The next evening arrived with an unusual atmospheric disturbance over Lunaris Grove. Dark clouds gathered above Aurora Heights, swirling around St. Cassian's spires in a way that made Dr. Callista Reeves think of her meteorologist colleagues' recent warnings about unusual weather patterns. The townspeople hurried through Moonweaver Square, casting nervous glances at the threatening sky as they made their way to evening mass. Inside the Basilica, the air felt charged with anticipation. News of yesterday's conversation between Meridith and Father Ambrose had spread through the town like wildfire, adding layers of complexity to what had initially seemed a simple challenge of faith versus reason. The revelation about Elena Kavari had transformed their wealthy adversary from a cold corporate titan into something more human, more vulnerable. Meridith hadn't planned to attend Mass again until the challenge's conclusion, but something had drawn her back to St. Cassian's. Perhaps it was the weather, which her weather monitoring apps couldn't quite explain. Or perhaps it was the weight of Elena's journal in her designer briefcase, seeming to grow heavier with each passing hour. She slipped into the Basilica just as Father Ambrose began his sermon, choosing a seat near the back. But tonight would be different from any service Lunaris Grove had ever witnessed. Father Ambrose had barely spoken his first words when Meridith stood up, her voice cutting through the sacred atmosphere like a scalpel. "Tell them the truth, Father. Tell them what faith really costs." The congregation turned as one to face her. Soren, from his position near the altar, tensed visibly, but Father Ambrose raised a calming hand. Meridith strode forward, her heels echoing off ancient stones. "You all sit here finding comfort in rituals and prayers, but let me tell you what blind faith does." She pulled out Elena's journal, holding it up like evidence in a trial. "My sister was brilliant. She could have changed the world. Instead, she spent her final days writing about mystical experiences and divine revelations." Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the stained glass windows in an ethereal display. Thunder followed immediately, so close it made the candles flicker. "Ms. Kavari," Father Ambrose began, but Meridith wasn't finished. "I've brought something to show you all," she announced, pulling out her tablet. With a few quick taps, she activated a holographic projection system she'd had installed earlier that day. The space above the altar filled with complex mathematical equations and medical data. "This is what killed my sister. Cold, hard facts. Cellular degradation, metastatic spread, chemical imbalances. Where was God in any of this?" The holographic display shifted to show brain scans. "Look at these images. This is what was happening to Elena's mind when she turned to faith. You call it a spiritual awakening? I call it the desperate hallucinations of a dying brain." Elisara Pendry stood up slowly, her aged voice carrying surprising strength. "Child, pain speaks louder than truth in your words." Meridith spun to face her, the projection shifting with her movement. "Truth? You want truth? Here's truth. I developed an AI system that could have saved thousands of lives like Elena's, but it wasn't ready in time for her. Every second you spend praying could be spent advancing medicine, developing cures, actually helping people." The storm outside intensified, rain now pounding against the Basilica's ancient windows. The holographic display began to glitch, equations fragmenting and reassembling in strange patterns. Soren stepped forward, his voice gentle despite the tension. "Sometimes the truth we're looking for isn't in the data, Ms. Kavari. Your sister understood that." "Don't you dare speak about my sister!" Meridith's composure cracked slightly. "None of you knew her. None of you saw how faith stole her rationality, her scientific brilliance. She was working on quantum entanglement theories that could have revolutionized computing. Instead, she spent her final months writing about finding God in the equations." Lightning struck again, closer this time, and the holographic display suddenly failed completely. In the dramatic darkness that followed, only the candles illuminated the scene. Father Ambrose descended from the altar, moving slowly toward Meridith. "Perhaps, Ms. Kavari, your sister didn't lose her rationality. Perhaps she found a deeper rationality than science alone can provide." "Stop," Meridith's voice cracked. "Just stop." But Father Ambrose continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the Basilica. "Elena's journal isn't evidence of defeat, but of victory. She didn't abandon science. She transcended it. In her final equations, she found what many great scientists have found, that the deeper we delve into the mysteries of the universe, the more we discover its divine architecture." Meridith pulled out her phone, her hands shaking slightly. "Let me read you her last email to me. Let everyone hear how faith destroys reason." She began reading. "Dearest Mary, I've discovered something extraordinary. The quantum equations we've been working with, they're not just mathematics. They're poetry, written in the language of creation. Every particle, every wave function, every moment of quantum uncertainty points to a universe that's not just existing, but thinking, feeling, loving." Her voice faltered as she continued. "The cancer's not taking my mind, Mary. It's stripping away the barriers that kept me from seeing the full picture. God isn't the enemy of science, he's its author. And when you finally see it, everything we've learned, everything we've discovered, becomes more magnificent, not less. The storm outside reached a crescendo, rain and wind howling through the ancient bell tower. The candles flickered wildly, creating dancing shadows on the walls. "Your sister," Father Ambrose said softly, "found what many great minds have found throughout history, that faith and reason are not opposing forces, but complementary revelations of the same truth. Einstein spoke of God not playing dice with the universe. Newton considered his scientific work a form of religious study. Your own quantum computers operate on principles that border on the mystical, particles affecting each other across vast distances, possibilities existing in superposition until observed." Meridith's tablet suddenly came back to life, but instead of her carefully prepared displays, it showed an error message she'd never seen before. "Quantum state undefined. Consciousness observer effect detected." "That's impossible," she whispered, staring at the screen. "That code doesn't even exist in the system." Dr. Callista Reeves stood up from her pew. "Ms. Kavari, as a fellow scientist, may I share something? In my years of medical practice, I've seen things that science can explain and things it can't. The most brilliant doctors I know are often the most humble, because they've witnessed the point where scientific knowledge ends and mystery begins." The storm abruptly ceased, leaving a silence that seemed to vibrate with possibility. In that silence, Meridith looked around the Basilica, seeing not just a gathering of believers, but a community of people who had faced their own struggles between faith and doubt. "5 days," she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. "5 days remain in the challenge. But I warn you, it will take more than convenient weather and technological glitches to prove anything to me." Elena's brilliant mind was corrupted by false hope. I won't let the same happen to her legacy. As she turned to leave, Father Ambrose spoke one last time. "Miss Kavari, have you considered that you're not here to save us from our faith, but that perhaps faith is here to save you from your grief?" Meridith paused at the door, not turning back. "Save your paradoxes, Father. Ideal and provable realities." But her hand was clutching Elena's journal so tightly her knuckles had turned white. After she left, the Basilica remained silent for several long moments. Finally, young Tommy Quinn, Vesper's nephew, spoke up. "Father, is God going to answer her challenge?" Father Ambrose smiled gently. "Tommy, I believe he already is. Sometimes the greatest miracles aren't in grand displays of power, but in the gentle opening of a wounded heart." Outside, the clouds began to clear, revealing a sky filled with stars. Meridith stood in Moonweaver Square, looking up at their cold, distant light, trying to see them as Elena had in her final days, not as burning balls of gas billions of miles away, but as testament to something greater than human understanding could encompass. For the first time since her sister's death, she felt uncertainty creeping into her carefully ordered worldview. And in the bell tower of St. Cassian's, the evening bells began to toll, their sound carrying across Lunaris Grove like a reminder that some truths resonate beyond the realm of scientific proof. Dawn broke over Lunaris Grove with unusual clarity after the previous night's storm. The morning light revealed scattered branches and debris across Moonweaver Square, evidence of the tempest that had raged during Meridith's confrontation at St. Cassian's. But something else had been scattered too. The carefully constructed walls around Meridith's heart had sustained their first real cracks. She sat in her hotel suite study, surrounded by holographic displays showing weather data, atmospheric readings, and electrical field measurements from the previous night. None of it made sense. The storm had appeared seemingly out of nowhere, defying all meteorological predictions. More disturbing still was the inexplicable malfunction of her quantum-based systems, technology she had personally designed to be virtually fail-proof. A gentle knock at her door interrupted her analysis. When she opened it, she found Soren Devereux standing there, holding 2 cups of coffee from the Morning Star Cafe. "I thought you might need this," he said, offering her one of the cups. It's been a rough couple of days. Meridith hesitated, then accepted the coffee. If Father Ambrose sent you— He didn't, Soren interrupted, then smiled slightly. Actually, he advised against it. Said you needed space to process, but I thought you might need something else. Someone who understands both worlds you're trying to bridge. Something in his tone made Meridith look at him more closely. What do you mean? Soren gestured to the displays behind her. The quantum entanglement equations on your screen. They're elegant, but you're missing a crucial variable in the consciousness observer effect calculations. Meridith's eyes widened. Only someone with advanced quantum physics knowledge would have caught that detail, let alone understood its significance. Who are you, really? Before I came to Lunaris Grove, I was Dr. Soren Devereaux, quantum physics professor at MIT, he replied quietly. I probably reviewed some of your sister's early papers. Elena's work on quantum consciousness was revolutionary. Meridith invited him in, her curiosity overriding her usual caution. As they sat in her study, Soren explained his story. 3 years ago, I was where you are now, convinced that science could explain everything, that faith was a crutch for those who couldn't handle reality. Then I encountered something that shattered my worldview completely. He pulled out his phone and showed her a scientific paper from a prestigious physics journal. The author's name caught her eye, Dr. Soren Devereaux, titled Quantum Entanglement and Consciousness, Implications for Non-Local Reality. This paper destroyed my career, he said without bitterness. Not because it was wrong. The math was perfect, the experiments reproducible. It destroyed my career because it proved something that modern science wasn't ready to accept. That consciousness itself influences quantum reality in ways that can't be explained by our current understanding of physics. Meridith scrolled through the paper, her coffee forgotten. The equations were beautiful, elegant, and deeply disturbing in their implications. This suggests that the observer effect in quantum mechanics isn't just about measurement disrupting systems, Soren finished. It's about consciousness itself being fundamentally entangled with reality at a quantum level. In other words, the divide between mind and matter, between observer and observed, isn't as clear as we thought. He stood and walked to one of her holographic displays, studying the data from the previous night's storm. Your sister Elena was working on similar theories near the end, wasn't she? Meridith felt a familiar pain in her chest. How did you know? Because her final papers, though unpublished, followed the same path my research did. She was discovering what I discovered, that at the deepest level of reality, science and spirituality begin to converge. Lightning flashed in Meridith's mind, the memory of Elena's last conversation with her. The equations, Mary, they're showing us something incredible. Consciousness isn't just observing reality, it's participating in it. Every prayer, every intention, every moment of connection. It's all quantum entanglement on a cosmic scale. Soren touched one of the holographic displays, manipulating the data with the ease of someone intimately familiar with advanced physics. Look at these readings from last night. The storm's electromagnetic patterns weren't random. They followed a very specific quantum signature, one that matches patterns my team observed during our consciousness experiments. That's impossible, Meridith whispered, but her voice lacked its usual certainty. 3 years ago, I would have agreed with you, Soren replied. I was the youngest quantum physics professor at MIT, on track for a Nobel Prize. But when my research led me to conclusions that challenged the materialist paradigm, the academic world turned its back on me. I lost everything: my position, my funding, my reputation. So you came here? To hide? Meridith couldn't keep the incredulity from her voice. Soren smiled, but his eyes held a depth of understanding that made Meridith uncomfortable. No, Miss Kavari. I came here to find what your sister found. That there are truths bigger than our ability to measure them, and that sometimes the most rational response to evidence is to accept that our rationality has limits. He pulled up another set of data on her displays. Your quantum computers aren't malfunctioning. They're detecting something that your algorithms aren't programmed to recognize. The same thing Elena's equations were pointing to. The same thing my research proved. Consciousness isn't just an emergent property of brain chemistry. It's a fundamental force in the universe, as real as gravity or electromagnetism. Meridith sat down heavily, her professional composure cracking. Elena said something similar in her final weeks. I thought it was the cancer affecting her mind. Or maybe, Soren suggested gently, the cancer stripped away the barriers that keep us from seeing the bigger picture. When you're facing death, when all your carefully constructed certainties are crumbling, sometimes you can see truths that your rational mind usually filters out. He reached into his bag and pulled out a worn scientific journal. This was going to be my follow-up paper before everything fell apart. I want you to read it. Not because it proves God exists, but because it proves that the universe is stranger and more wonderful than our current scientific framework can explain. As he headed toward the door, he turned back one last time. Elena wasn't losing her mind at the end, Miss Kavari. She was expanding it. The question is, are you willing to expand yours? After he left, Meridith sat in her study for a long time, surrounded by displays showing data she could no longer fully explain. Her hand found Elena's pendant again, and for the first time she allowed herself to consider a possibility that both terrified and fascinated her. That her sister's final insights weren't a retreat from science, but an advance into territory that science was only beginning to explore. Outside her window, the morning sun caught the stained glass windows of St. Cassian's, sending prismatic patterns dancing across Moonweaver Square. 4 days remained in her challenge, but suddenly the lines between proof and faith, between science and miracle, seemed less clear than they had just hours before. In the Basilica's bell tower, Father Ambrose watched Soren leave the hotel, a quiet smile on his face. Sometimes the most powerful miracles weren't supernatural events, but the simple act of one wounded healer helping another find their way back to wholeness. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through Lunaris Grove, as Meridith sat in the celestial gardens, surrounded by the roses that seemed to thrive in the sacred ground of St. Cassian's. She had spent the morning poring over Soren's research papers, her brilliant mind wrestling with implications that threatened to overturn everything she had built her life upon. Her tablet lay beside her, displaying Elena's final research notes, which she had finally forced herself to read in full. The parallels between her sister's work and Soren's findings were undeniable and deeply disturbing. Both had discovered patterns in quantum mechanics that suggested consciousness wasn't just an observer of reality, but an active participant in its creation. Beautiful, aren't they? The voice startled her. Dr. Callista Reeves stood nearby, gesturing to the roses. These bushes were planted over a century ago, yet they bloom more vigorously than any modern hybrid. Father Ambrose says it's because they've absorbed decades of prayers. As a doctor, I used to smile at such notions. Used to? Meridith asked, despite herself. Callista sat down beside her, her medical bag still in hand from her rounds. 20 years of practicing medicine teaches you humility. I've seen terminal patients recover without explanation, watched injuries heal at impossible rates, observed phenomena that no medical textbook can explain. She pulled out a tablet of her own, bringing up a patient file. Take this case from last month. 6-year-old boy, severe trauma after an accident. Every medical indicator suggested brain death. We were discussing organ donation with the family. Then, during evening prayers at the Basilica, at the exact moment Father Ambrose called for healing. She handed the tablet to Meridith. The medical data stopped Meridith cold. The timestamps clearly showed a massive spike in neural activity precisely at 7:42 p.m., corresponding with the evening prayer service. Within hours, the boy had regained consciousness. Within days, he had made a full recovery. I ran every test, consulted specialists worldwide, Callista continued. No one could explain it. But here's what fascinated me as a scientist. During that spike in neural activity, we recorded quantum coherence patterns in his brain tissue that should have been impossible. The same patterns, Ms. Kavari, that your sister Elena described in her final papers. Meridith's hands trembled slightly as she studied the data. This could be coincidence. Of course, Callista agreed easily. Any single case could be coincidence. But I've been quietly documenting similar cases for years. Would you like to see my research? Before Meridith could respond, a commotion arose from the Basilica. They turned to see people rushing inside, voices raised in concern. Callista stood quickly, grabbing her medical bag. "Something's wrong." They hurried to the church, where they found a crowd gathered around Elisara Pendry, who had collapsed during her daily prayers. The elderly woman lay pale and still on the cold stone floor, her breathing shallow. "Heart attack," Callista diagnosed quickly, kneeling beside her. "Call an ambulance." Meridith watched as the doctor worked, her trained mind automatically calculating probabilities, survival rates, statistical outcomes. But something else was happening too, something that defied her mathematical models. Father Ambrose knelt opposite Callista, his hands gentle on Elisara's forehead. The gathered crowd began to pray, their voices rising in a harmony that seemed to make the very air vibrate. Soren appeared at Meridith's side, his expression intense. "Watch," he whispered, holding up a small quantum sensor he'd apparently been carrying. "Watch what happens to the field readings." Meridith's scientific training warred with what her eyes were telling her. The quantum coherence patterns on Soren's sensor were impossible, showing levels of organized complexity that shouldn't exist in nature. Yet as the prayers continued, as Father Ambrose's voice rose in ancient Latin, the patterns grew stronger. Elisara's eyes fluttered open. Color returned to her cheeks. By the time the ambulance arrived, she was sitting up, talking coherently, her vital signs stable. The paramedics were baffled. "Coincidence," Meridith whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. "Is it?" Soren showed her the sensor readings. "These patterns. They're identical to what I recorded in my consciousness experiments at MIT, identical to what Elena described in her final papers, identical to what Dr. Reeves documented in that boy's recovery." Callista joined them, wiping her hands on a cloth. "From a medical perspective, what just happened here is impossible. Elisara's heart literally restarted itself. I've never seen anything like it." "There's always a scientific explanation," Meridith insisted, but she couldn't take her eyes off the quantum readings. "Science is not the enemy of miracles, Ms. Kavari," Father Ambrose said, approaching them quietly. "It's simply our way of understanding how God works in the world. Your sister understood this at the end. She saw that science doesn't disprove faith, it illuminates it." Meridith's hand went to Elena's pendant. Elena was brilliant. If she saw a pattern. "She saw more than a pattern," Soren interjected gently. "She saw what I saw in my research, that consciousness, prayer, intention. They're not separate from the quantum fabric of reality. They're woven into it." The Basilica had grown quiet, the crowd dispersing as Elisara was taken to the hospital for observation. Meridith stood in the nave, looking up at the play of light through the stained glass windows. The mathematics of it struck her suddenly, the precise angles, the perfect interplay of color and shadow. "Elena's last message to me," she said quietly, almost to herself. "She wrote about finding God in the equations, about mathematics being the language of creation." "Because she finally saw the whole picture," Father Ambrose replied. "Not just the equations themselves, but what they were pointing to, the deeper order beneath the chaos." Meridith's tablet chimed, another error message from her quantum systems. But this time, instead of dismissing it as a malfunction, she really looked at it. The error wasn't random. It contained a pattern, a signature she recognized from Elena's work. "This is impossible," she whispered. "No," Soren corrected gently. "This is what happens when our instruments start detecting something our theories haven't caught up to yet. This is the boundary where science and faith meet." As if in response, the Basilica's bells began to toll, their harmonics setting up standing waves that made Soren's quantum sensor light up with complex patterns. Meridith watched the readings, her rational mind struggling to process what she was seeing. 3 days, she said finally, her voice uncertain. 3 days left in the challenge. "The real challenge," Father Ambrose suggested quietly, "may not be proving God's existence to you, Ms. Kavari. It may be helping you accept the proof that's already there. The proof your sister found, that Dr. Devereaux found, that's written into the very mathematics you revere." Meridith left the Basilica in silence, her mind churning. The roses in Celestial Gardens seemed different now. Not just beautiful, but mathematically perfect in their spiral patterns, their Fibonacci sequences, their quantum-level organization. For the first time since Elena's death, she allowed herself to consider a terrifying possibility, that she hadn't come to Lunaris Grove to disprove God's existence, but to find what her sister had found. That perhaps the true miracle wouldn't be some grand supernatural display, but the simple, profound recognition that science itself pointed to something greater. As she walked back to her hotel, she passed Dr. Reeves heading to the hospital to check on Elisara. The doctor paused, turning back to her. "Ms. Kavari, sometimes the most scientific response to evidence is to admit that our current scientific framework might be incomplete." Meridith nodded slightly, unable to form words. In her hand, she clutched both Elena's journal and Soren's research papers, no longer certain where science ended and faith began. The third day of Meridith's challenge dawned with an eerie stillness over Lunaris Grove. The morning air felt heavy, charged with an electricity that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. Her quantum sensors were going haywire, showing readings that defied every known law of physics. In her hotel suite, Meridith sat surrounded by a storm of her own making, papers scattered everywhere, holographic displays showing countless data streams, and in the center of it all, Elena's journal opened to its final entry. She hadn't slept, spending the night cross-referencing her sister's findings with Soren's research and Dr. Reeves's medical data. A urgent knock at her door broke her concentration. It was Soren, his face grave. "You need to come to the Basilica. Now." "What's wrong?" "Everything." They hurried through the unusually empty streets. The sky had taken on a strange, greenish tinge that made Meridith's scientific mind scream warnings about severe atmospheric disturbance. At St. Cassian's, they found Father Ambrose and Dr. Reeves in intense discussion, surrounded by worried townspeople. "The instruments at the weather station are showing impossible readings," Dr. Reeves explained as they approached. "It's like every meteorological system in the region is converging on Lunaris Grove." "That's not the worst of it," Soren added, pulling out his quantum sensor. "The coherence patterns we've been tracking, they're amplifying exponentially. It's like the fabric of reality itself is building toward some kind of crescendo." Meridith pulled out her tablet, accessing Kavari Tech's satellite data. What she saw made her blood run cold. "This is impossible. The atmospheric patterns, they're forming a perfect Mandelbrot set over Lunaris Grove. That doesn't happen in nature." "Doesn't it?" Father Ambrose's voice was calm despite the growing chaos. "Or have we simply never had the instruments to see it before?" Before Meridith could respond, a violent tremor shook the Basilica. The ancient stones groaned and several of the smaller stained glass windows cracked. People screamed, rushing for the exits, but Father Ambrose's voice rang out. "Stay inside." The Basilica has stood for centuries. It's the safest place in town. Dr. Reeves's phone rang, the hospital calling with an emergency. "The equipment, all of it's malfunctioning. Every electronic device in the building is showing the same error message." Meridith's breath caught as she saw the message on her own tablet. "Quantum state undefined. Consciousness observer effect detected." The same error she'd seen during her confrontation in the church. Another tremor rocked the building, stronger this time. Soren's quantum sensor was practically screaming with readings. "The coherence patterns. They're reaching critical levels. If this continues..." "If this continues, what?" Meridith demanded. "I don't know. We're in uncharted territory. The only time I've seen readings even close to this was during my consciousness experiments at MIT, and that was on a microscopic scale. This is..." Cosmic thunder cracked overhead, so loud it shook dust from the Basilica's ancient beams. The stained glass windows began to vibrate at a frequency that made them hum in harmonic resonance. And then, in the midst of the chaos, something extraordinary happened. The quantum readings suddenly stabilized into a pattern that made both Meridith and Soren gasp. On their screens, clear as day, was the exact equation Elena had written in her final paper. the one that suggested consciousness itself was a fundamental force in the universe. "Elena," Meridith whispered, her hand going to her sister's pendant. At that moment, the pendant began to grow warm. No, not warm. It was generating light, a soft blue glow that pulsed in perfect synchronization with the quantum readings. Meridith tried to remove it, but it seemed fused to her skin. "What's happening?" she demanded, fear finally cracking her scientific composure. Father Ambrose stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the glowing pendant. "Your sister's last gift. What did she tell you when she gave it to you?" Meridith's mind raced back to that final conversation. She said it would help me see what she saw. I thought she was delirious. Or perhaps, Soren suggested, his voice filled with wonder, she encoded her discovery into the very atomic structure of the pendant. Quantum information storage. It's theoretical, but Elena was brilliant enough to... Another tremor, and suddenly the pendant's light expanded, filling the basilica with a web of luminescent patterns that exactly matched the quantum coherence displays. Within these patterns, mathematical equations began to form. Elena's equations, dancing in the air like living things. "The observer effect," Soren breathed. "Mass consciousness coherence. Elena's theories were right. Reality itself responds to concentrated consciousness." The townspeople, who had been watching in terrified awe, began to pray. As their voices rose, the patterns in the air shifted, becoming more complex, more beautiful. The quantum readings showed coherence levels that should have been impossible. And then Meridith heard it, a voice she had thought silenced forever. "Do you see it now, Mary?" Elena's voice, clear as day, emanating not from any physical source but seemingly from the patterns themselves. Meridith fell to her knees, her carefully constructed worldview crumbling. "This isn't possible," she whispered. "You're dead. This is some kind of mass hallucination." "Is it?" Elena's voice was gentle. "Or is it simply proof of what I tried to tell you? Consciousness doesn't end with death, Mary. It's fundamental to the universe itself. These patterns, these equations, they're not just mathematics. They're the language God uses to write reality." The tremors reached a crescendo. The basilica's bell tower began to toll on its own, each note corresponding perfectly to the harmonic frequencies in Soren's quantum readings. The patterns of light formed a complex, multi-dimensional mandala that both Meridith and Soren recognized. It was the visual representation of Elena's final equation, the one that suggested consciousness and reality were inseparable. "How?" Meridith managed to ask, tears streaming down her face. "How did you do this?" "I didn't," Elena's voice replied. "I simply discovered it. The universe itself did this. God did this. Science and faith, Mary. They're two sides of the same coin. I encoded that truth into the pendant, knowing that when the time was right, when enough concentrated consciousness was focused in one place." Another tremor shook the basilica, but this one felt different. Not destructive, but transformative. The light patterns began to coalesce around Meridith, and suddenly she could see, not with her eyes but with something deeper. She saw the quantum web that connected all consciousness, saw how prayer and intention created ripples in the fabric of reality itself, saw what Elena had seen in her final days. "Oh God," she whispered, and for the first time in her life, it wasn't an expression, but a recognition. The storm outside began to fade, the tremors subsiding. The light patterns slowly dimmed, though the pendant continued to pulse softly. In the sudden quiet, Meridith became aware that she was weeping, that Soren was staring at his readings in stunned disbelief, that Father Ambrose was smiling gently. 2 days remain in your challenge, Ms. Kavari, the priest said softly, though I suspect the answer you were looking for has already found you. Meridith looked down at her tablet, at the quantum readings that had recorded everything. Her scientific mind was already trying to analyze, to explain, to rationalize. But something had changed. She could feel it in the depths of her being. The wall between faith and reason hadn't just cracked, it had dissolved completely. Elena's voice came one last time, fading like a dream. The greatest miracle, Mary, isn't that God exists. It's that he wrote his existence into the very equations you love so much. You just needed the right eyes to see it. As the townspeople began to stir, to talk in hushed voices about what they'd witnessed, Meridith remained on her knees, Elena's pendant pulsing gently against her heart. She had come to Lunaris Grove to demand proof of God's existence. Instead, she had found something far more profound. The realization that proof had been there all along, written in the language she knew best, mathematics. The hours following the extraordinary events at St. Cassian's found Meridith pacing her hotel suite like a caged tiger. Every scientific instrument she possessed had recorded the impossible. Her quantum computers, the most advanced in the world, had captured data that defied every known law of physics. Yet her rational mind was already at work, trying to explain away what she had experienced. Dawn was breaking over Lunaris Grove, casting long shadows through her windows, when a soft knock interrupted her internal struggle. Dr. Callista Reeves stood at her door, looking exhausted but determined. "I thought you might need these," the doctor said, holding up a thick folder of medical records. "Every inexplicable recovery, every miracle I've documented in 20 years of practice, including complete brain scans before and after. Events like what we witnessed yesterday." Meridith let her in, clearing space among the chaos of papers and tablets covering every surface. "How do you do it?" she asked abruptly. "How do you reconcile your medical training with things that shouldn't be possible?" Callista smiled sadly, spreading out her records. "I struggled with it for years, tried to explain everything away with standard medical terminology, until I had my own Elena moment." "Your own?" 7 years ago, I was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Terminal. I had months to live at best. The doctor's eyes grew distant with memory. I came to St. Cassian's, not seeking a miracle, just peace. What I found instead was something that changed everything I thought I knew about medicine and faith. She pulled out a series of brain scans. "These are my own scans, before, during, and after what happened in the Basilica that day. The quantum coherence patterns? They're identical to what we recorded yesterday. Identical to what your sister documented. Identical to what Dr. Devereaux found in his research." Meridith studied the scans with trembling hands. The patterns were unmistakable, the same mathematical signature that had manifested during yesterday's event. "But it could be," she began. "A coincidence?" Callista interrupted gently. "One case might be. 2, perhaps. But I've documented over 300 cases in this town alone, each one showing the exact same quantum signature at the moment of inexplicable healing." Meridith sank into a chair, Elena's pendant still pulsing softly against her skin. "I heard her voice," she whispered. "I heard Elena. That's not possible. The dead don't speak." "Don't they?" Soren's voice came from the doorway, where he stood holding fresh readings from his quantum sensors. "The quantum information theory your sister was working on before she died. It suggested that consciousness itself might be quantum information, and quantum information can't be destroyed. It can only be transformed." He spread out his latest readings beside Callista's medical records. "Look at the pattern. Really look at it. What does it remind you of?" Meridith's breath caught. The quantum signature formed a perfect fractal pattern, one she recognized from Elena's final papers. "The consciousness wave function," she whispered. Elena theorized that human consciousness created quantum ripples that persisted after death, becoming part of the universal quantum field. "Like waves in a pond," Father Ambrose added, appearing quietly in the doorway. "Each life creating ripples that continue long after the stone has sunk beneath the surface." Meridith stood abruptly, anger flaring. No, I won't accept this. There has to be a rational explanation. Mass hallucination, quantum entanglement on an unprecedented scale. Something. Why?" Father Ambrose's question was gentle but pointed. "Why must there be an explanation that excludes the divine? What if, as your sister discovered, God works through quantum mechanics, not despite them?" "Because," Meridith's voice broke, "because if this is real, If Elena was right, then I wasted our final month together fighting her insights instead of sharing them. I dismissed her greatest discovery as delusion. The pendant pulsed warmer, and suddenly the room filled with soft blue light again. But this time, instead of equations, it showed memories. Elena in her hospital room, excitedly explaining her theories to an angry, disbelieving Meridith. Elena writing in her journal, her face alight with the joy of discovery, even as her body failed her. Elena pressing the pendant into Meridith's hand, whispering, "When you're ready to see, Mary. When you're finally ready to understand." "Your sister never blamed you," Father Ambrose said softly. "She knew you would need proof. That's why she encoded her discoveries into that pendant. Not just the equations, but her consciousness itself, quantum entangled with the very atoms of the metal." Meridith touched the pendant, tears flowing freely now. "But this changes everything. Everything I've built my life on. Everything I've believed about reality." "Does it?" Soren asked, manipulating the quantum readings to show a new pattern. "Or does it simply expand our understanding? Look at these equations, Meridith. Really look at them. They don't invalidate quantum mechanics. They complete it. They don't disprove science. They show us what science has been pointing toward all along." Dr. Reeves laid a gentle hand on Meridith's shoulder. "When I was healed, I had the same crisis of faith, not in God, but in everything I thought I knew about medicine. Then I realized something. Accepting miracles didn't make me a worse doctor. It made me a better one. Because I finally understood that science isn't about limiting what's possible. It's about expanding our understanding of what is." The room fell silent except for the soft hum of quantum sensors and the gentle pulse of Elena's pendant. Meridith stood by the window, looking out at St. Cassian's rising against the morning sky. 2 days remained in her challenge, but the real challenge wasn't proving or disproving God's existence anymore. It was facing the possibility that everything she thought she knew about reality was just the surface of something far more profound. "Elena tried to tell me," she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. "She said that quantum mechanics wasn't disproving God, it was revealing him. That consciousness wasn't just an emergent property of brain chemistry, but a fundamental force in the universe. That prayer wasn't just wishful thinking, but actual quantum manipulation of reality." "And now?" Father Ambrose asked gently. Meridith turned to face them, her expression a complex mixture of fear, wonder, and dawning acceptance. "Now I have to decide what's harder to believe. That the most brilliant quantum physicist I've ever known discovered something revolutionary about the nature of reality in her final days, or that she lost her mind and somehow managed to encode that lost mind into quantum storage that shouldn't be possible for another 50 years of technological development." The pendant pulsed once more, projecting a single equation into the air. Elena's final equation, the one that suggested consciousness and divine will were two expressions of the same underlying quantum reality. "The hardest part of faith," Father Ambrose said softly, "isn't believing in God. It's accepting that our understanding of reality might be far more limited than we thought. That science and faith aren't enemies, but two languages describing the same profound truth." As the morning light filled the room, Meridith Kavari, brilliant scientist, skeptic, and grieving sister, stood at the crossroads of science and faith, finally understanding that the real miracle wasn't in choosing between them, but in seeing how perfectly they complemented each other. Just as Elena had tried to tell her all along. News of the extraordinary events at St. Cassian's spread through Lunaris Grove like wildfire, then beyond its borders into the wider world. By midday, satellite trucks from major news networks had begun arriving, their crews setting up in Moonweaver Square. The peaceful rhythm of the small town was transforming as the outside world pressed in, drawn by rumors of impossible occurrences and scientific anomalies. Meridith stood in Father Ambrose's office, watching the growing media circus through the leaded glass windows. Her phone hadn't stopped ringing since dawn. Calls from Kavaritech's board of directors, scientific colleagues, religious leaders, and journalists from every major publication. "Your challenge has sparked something larger than Lunaris Grove," Father Ambrose observed, pouring tea from an ancient silver service. The world is hungry for proof that science and faith can coexist. Before Meridith could respond, Soren burst into the office, his face alight with excitement. "You need to see this," he said, pulling up multiple holographic displays. "The quantum coherence patterns we recorded? They're spreading." The displays showed a map of the region, overlaid with complex mathematical patterns. Like ripples in a pond, the quantum signatures recorded during yesterday's event were expanding outward from Lunaris Grove in perfect mathematical progression. "That's not the most extraordinary part," Dr. Reeves added, entering with her own tablet. "We're getting reports from hospitals throughout the region. Patients in persistent vegetative states are showing unprecedented brain activity. The patterns match exactly what we recorded here." Meridith studied the data, her scientific mind racing. "The quantum entanglement effect. It's propagating through the collective consciousness field that Elena theorized existed. But this is impossible. The energy required to maintain quantum coherence at this scale. Unless," Soren suggested quietly, "consciousness itself is the medium of transmission. Elena's equations suggested that consciousness wasn't affected by normal quantum decoherence limitations." A commotion outside drew their attention. The square was filling with people, not just journalists but pilgrims. Word had spread about healing miracles, about scientific instruments recording the impossible, about a tech billionaire's challenge to God receiving an answer that merged scientific proof with divine mystery. Vesper Quinn rushed in, slightly out of breath. "You need to come to the square. Something's happening." They hurried outside to find a scene that defied description. Hundreds of people had gathered, many holding up phones and tablets that were all displaying the same error message. "Quantum state undefined. Consciousness observer effect detected." The same message that had appeared on Meridith's systems. But more extraordinary still were the lights, soft blue illuminations appearing spontaneously among the crowd, similar to the light from Elena's pendant. Dr. Reeves's medical monitors were showing impossible readings from multiple patients in the square. Soren's quantum sensors were registering coherence patterns that made yesterday's readings look minimal by comparison. "It's like," Meridith whispered, "like reality itself is thin here now. Like what happened yesterday created a permanent quantum interference pattern in the fabric of space-time." A young woman pushed through the crowd towards them, tears streaming down her face. She held up a medical bracelet from a nearby hospital. "I had stage 4 cancer," she said, her voice shaking. "Had. Past tense. They just ran the tests 3 times. It's gone. Completely gone. The doctors are saying it's impossible, but..." More people came forward, each with their own story. A blind man who could suddenly see. A child's autism symptoms dramatically improving. Even the skeptical journalists found their instruments recording phenomena that defied explanation. Marcus, Meridith's chief of staff, finally managed to reach her through the crowd. "Meridith, the board is in panic mode. Our quantum computing systems worldwide are showing unprecedented patterns. Every Kavari Tech AI is reporting anomalies that match the theoretical models in Elena's final papers. This is going to change everything." Meridith looked around at the scene unfolding in Moonweaver Square. Science and faith colliding and merging in ways that would reshape humanity's understanding of reality. Her challenge had intended to prove God's non-existence. Instead, it had sparked something that would transform both scientific and religious understanding forever. "Dr. Devereaux," a voice called out. A group of physicists from major universities had arrived, drawn by reports of quantum phenomena that matched the predictions in Soren's controversial papers. "Your research. We owe you an apology. The data we're recording. It's validating everything you proposed." Father Ambrose watched it all with a gentle smile. "Your sister would be proud, Ms. Kavari. Her work is bringing together the 2 worlds she loved, science and faith." The pendant at Meridith's throat pulsed warmly, and suddenly her voice carried across the square with perfect clarity. "This isn't an ending. It's a beginning." Elena saw it coming. She knew that someday, science would advance enough to detect what faith has always known, that consciousness, divine will, and quantum reality are all expressions of the same fundamental truth. The crowd fell silent, feeling the weight of the moment. Here, in a small town square, witnessed by scientists and believers alike, something profound was occurring. The birth of a new understanding that would bridge the ancient divide between faith and reason. Dr. Reeves's medical monitors continued to record impossible healings. Soren's quantum sensors showed coherence patterns expanding further with each passing moment. Journalists' cameras captured phenomena that defied conventional physics. And through it all, Elena's pendant pulsed with a steady light, like a beacon showing the way forward. "One day remains in your challenge," Father Ambrose said quietly to Meridith. "Though I suspect the real challenge is only beginning, helping the world understand what's happening here." Meridith nodded, watching as more people arrived in Moonweaver Square, drawn by something greater than themselves. Her challenge had started as a personal quest to disprove God's existence. It had become something far more profound, a moment when science and faith finally found their common ground, proving what Elena had discovered in her final days, that the deepest truths of existence couldn't be contained by either discipline alone. As the sun began to set over Lunaris Grove, painting the sky in colors that seemed more vivid than ever before, the bells of St. Cassian's began to toll. Their sound carried across the square, and with each toll, the quantum readings pulsed in perfect synchronization. Science and faith, reason and wonder, human consciousness and divine presence, all dancing together in a harmony that Elena had glimpsed and that the world was finally ready to see. As night fell over Lunaris Grove, the crowd in Moonweaver Square had swelled to thousands. Television crews broadcast live around the clock, their cameras capturing the soft blue lights that continued to appear spontaneously throughout the gathering. Scientists from major institutions huddled over instruments, debating the implications of readings that defied every known law of physics. But Meridith Kavari wasn't in the square. She sat alone in St. Cassian's, in the exact spot where Elena had spent her final days in prayer. The Basilica was quiet, the chaos outside muted by ancient stones. Her tablet displayed hundreds of messages from Kavari text board, from scientific colleagues, from religious leaders seeking commentary. She ignored them all. Instead, she held Elena's journal, reading her sister's final entry by the light of votive candles. "Dearest Mary, tomorrow they're moving me to hospice. We both know what that means. But I'm not afraid anymore. What I've discovered here, in this quiet church, in these final equations, it's beyond anything we imagined possible. The quantum field isn't just mathematics. It's alive, Mary. Conscious. Divine. Every prayer, every act of faith, creates ripples in the quantum fabric of reality itself. God isn't hiding from science. He's revealing himself through it. You just need the right eyes to see." The pendant at her throat pulsed warmly, and suddenly the air around her filled with quantum equations, not projected this time but visible to her mind's eye with perfect clarity. She could see what Elena had seen. How consciousness itself was woven into the fabric of space-time. How quantum entanglement explained prayer's ability to affect reality. How the observer effect was really about the divine consciousness observing itself through human awareness. "You're finally ready to understand, aren't you?" The voice came from behind her. Meridith turned to find Soren standing in the candlelight, holding new quantum readings. But there was something different about him now, a familiar light in his eyes that made her breath catch. "You knew Elena," she said. It wasn't a question. Soren nodded, sitting beside her. "We worked together briefly at MIT, before my research into consciousness and quantum mechanics got me labeled a heretic by the scientific community. Elena was the only one who understood what I was seeing in the data. She helped me refine the equations that eventually led to my exile from academia." He spread out the latest readings on the pew beside her. "Look at this pattern. Really look at it. What do you see?" Meridith studied the quantum signature, and suddenly everything clicked into place. "It's a fingerprint," she whispered. "A quantum fingerprint of consciousness itself. Elena's consciousness, still rippling through the quantum field, growing stronger as more observers become entangled with it. "Not just Elena's consciousness," Father Ambrose said, appearing silently from the shadows. "What you're seeing is the quantum signature of divine consciousness, expressing itself through human awareness. Your sister found the mathematical proof of something saints and mystics have known for millennia, that we are all connected through a field of conscious energy that transcends physical reality." Dr. Reeves entered hurriedly, her medical tablet displaying new data. "The healing effects are accelerating. We're recording spontaneous remissions across the region. The quantum coherence patterns are rewriting biological systems at the cellular level. It's like divine consciousness is healing through human consciousness," Meridith finished, standing up. Her voice had changed, carrying a new certainty. "That's what Elena discovered. That's what she was trying to tell me. Prayer, faith, intention. They're not just psychological exercises. They're quantum operations, creating interference patterns in the consciousness field itself." She walked to the altar, Elena's pendant pulsing with increasing brightness. "We've been looking at it all wrong. Science isn't separate from faith. It's the language God used to write the universe. Every quantum equation, every physical law, every mathematical principle. They're not just descriptions of reality. They're glimpses of divine thought made manifest." The pendant's light suddenly expanded, filling the Basilica with equations that seemed to write themselves in the air. But this time Meridith didn't see them as just mathematics. She saw them as Elena had, as expressions of a deeper truth that transcended both science and faith. "Elena didn't lose her scientific mind at the end," she said, tears flowing freely now. "She transcended it. She saw that consciousness wasn't just an emergent property of brain chemistry. It was the fundamental property of reality itself. Every quantum wave function, every probability cloud, every moment of quantum uncertainty. They're all moments of divine choice expressing itself through the mathematics we thought we invented." Outside, the crowd in Moonweaver Square had fallen silent. The blue lights that had been appearing sporadically now filled the entire town, pulsing in perfect synchronization with Elena's pendant. Soren's quantum sensors showed coherence patterns that stretched across the entire region, growing stronger with each moment. "The challenge," Father Ambrose said softly, "was never about proving God's existence to you, Ms. Kavari. It was about helping you understand what Elena discovered. That proof has been there all along, written in the very equations you devoted your life to studying." Meridith touched the pendant, and suddenly she could feel what Elena had felt. The vast field of conscious energy that permeated all reality. The quantum dance of divine thought expressing itself through physical law. The profound truth that science and faith were never meant to be enemies, but rather two perspectives on the same infinite reality. "One day remains in your challenge," Soren reminded her gently. "What will you tell the world?" Meridith looked around the Basilica, seeing it with new eyes. The mathematical perfection of its architecture, the quantum harmonics of its bells, the consciousness field generated by centuries of prayer. It was all there, waiting to be recognized by those with eyes to see and hearts to understand. "I'll tell them what Elena discovered," she said finally. "That science isn't just approaching a theory of everything. It's approaching a recognition of someone. That consciousness isn't just an accident of evolution, but the fundamental nature of reality itself. That every scientific advancement brings us closer to understanding what faith has always known." The pendant pulsed one final time, and in that pulse, Meridith felt Elena's presence more clearly than ever. Not as a ghost or a memory, but as a consciousness still active in the quantum field, still teaching, still showing the way forward. "The greatest miracle," she whispered, echoing Elena's final words, "isn't that God exists. It's that he wrote his existence into the very mathematics we thought would disprove him. We just needed the right eyes to see it." Outside, the bells of St. Cassian's began to toll, each note creating ripples in the quantum field that Meridith could now perceive directly. Science and faith, reason and wonder, human consciousness and divine presence. all coming together in a symphony of understanding that would transform the world's understanding of reality itself. The final morning of Meridith's challenge dawned over Lunaris Grove with an otherworldly beauty. The sky seemed more vibrant, the air more crystalline, as if reality itself had been refined by the events of the past week. The quantum phenomena that had begun in St. Cassian's now extended across the globe, with research institutions worldwide recording unprecedented patterns of coherence in the fabric of space-time. Meridith stood at the podium in Moonweaver Square, facing a sea of faces. News cameras broadcasted live to millions worldwide. Scientists, religious leaders, and ordinary people waited in breathless anticipation. This was the moment she would announce the results of her challenge, a challenge that had evolved far beyond its original intent. But before she could speak, she felt a familiar warmth from Elena's pendant, the quantum field that she could now perceive directly shimmed with possibility. She set aside her prepared remarks and closed her eyes, allowing a deeper truth to flow through her. 7 days ago, I stood in St. Cassian's Basilica and demanded proof of God's existence, she began, her voice carrying clearly across the hushed square. I came armed with quantum computers, advanced AI, and an unshakable belief in the supremacy of scientific rationality. I offered $50 million for proof that would satisfy my scientific standards. She touched the pendant, and it began to glow softly, its light visible even in the morning sun. What I received instead was something far more valuable, an understanding that transcends both science and faith while encompassing both. My sister Elena discovered it in her final days, and now I understand why it changed her so profoundly. Holographic displays activated around the square, showing the quantum readings that had been recorded over the past week. These patterns aren't just mathematical curiosities, they're glimpses into the fundamental nature of reality itself. What we're seeing is consciousness, not just human consciousness, but divine consciousness expressing itself through the quantum fabric of the universe. She gestured to Soren, who stepped forward with his latest readings. Dr. Devereaux's research, which the scientific community once rejected, provided the first mathematical framework for understanding what we're witnessing. The quantum field isn't just a physical phenomenon. It's a conscious, living field of intelligence that permeates all reality. Dr. Reeves joined them, bringing up medical data on the displays. The healings we've witnessed aren't violations of natural law. They're demonstrations of how consciousness shapes reality at the quantum level. Prayer, intention, faith. These aren't just psychological states. They're quantum operations that create interference patterns in the consciousness field itself. Meridith turned to Father Ambrose, who stood quietly nearby. I came here to disprove God's existence through science. Instead, I discovered what Elena tried to tell me, that science itself is revealing God's existence in ways more profound than any traditional proof could provide. She raised her hands, and suddenly the quantum equations became visible to everyone in the square, glowing in the air like living mathematics. Look at these equations. Really look at them. They're not just describing reality. They're showing us divine thought made manifest. Every quantum wave function, every probability field, every moment of quantum uncertainty, they're all moments of choice in the mind of God. The pendant's light expanded, creating a dome of quantum coherence over the entire square. Within it, people began to perceive directly what Meridith was describing, the living, conscious nature of reality itself. The challenge ends today, she announced, not because we've proven or disproven God's existence, but because we've transcended the very question. Science and faith were never meant to be enemies. They're two perspectives on the same infinite reality, two languages describing the same profound truth. She reached into her briefcase and withdrew not just the promised check, but documents that made the crowd gasp. The $50 million will go to establishing the Meridith Kavari Institute for Quantum Consciousness Studies here in Lunaris Grove. But more than that, Kavari Tech's entire quantum computing division will be relocated here, partnering with St. Cassian's to explore what my sister discovered. Father Ambrose stepped forward, his eyes bright with unshed tears. And the Basilica. Meridith smiled, her transformation now complete. will remain exactly what it has always been, a place where science and faith meet, where the deepest truths of existence can be explored through both prayer and quantum mechanics. Elena understood that we need both, and now I understand why. The quantum field rippled with increasing intensity as she spoke, the equations in the air growing more complex and beautiful. We're standing at the threshold of a new understanding, one that doesn't force us to choose between scientific truth and spiritual truth. The mathematics we thought would disprove God's existence has instead revealed His presence in every equation, every physical law, every moment of quantum possibility. Soren's instruments were recording coherence patterns that defied description. The healing effects that had begun in Lunaris Grove were now being reported worldwide. Reality itself seemed to be shifting, becoming more transparent to the conscious field that underlay it. "Elena," Meridith said softly, touching the pendant one last time. "You were right. The universe isn't just existing, it's thinking, feeling, loving. Every scientific discovery brings us closer to understanding what faith has always known. Every prayer creates ripples in the quantum field that shapes reality itself." As she spoke these words, something extraordinary happened. The quantum coherence field became visible to everyone present, revealing the living, conscious nature of reality that Elena had discovered. Scientists saw it in their equations, believers felt it in their prayers, and for one brief, beautiful moment, the artificial boundary between science and faith dissolved completely. "This isn't an ending," Meridith concluded, her voice filled with wonder and purpose. "It's the beginning of a new chapter in human understanding. Elena showed us the way. Now it's up to us to follow it, not by abandoning science or rejecting faith, but by recognizing that they're both essential for understanding the full scope of reality." The bells of St. Cassian's began to toll, their sound creating visible patterns in the quantum field. As their notes rang out across Lunaris Grove, Meridith Kavari, once the world's most prominent skeptic, stood transformed, ready to lead humanity into a new era of understanding where science and faith would work together to explore the greatest mystery of all, the conscious, living nature of reality itself. Elena's presence seemed to fill the square, not as a ghost or memory, but as a consciousness still active in the quantum field, rejoicing in her sister's final understanding of what she had discovered in her last days, that the universe wasn't just a collection of mathematical laws, but a living expression of divine thought, waiting to be recognized by those with the courage to see beyond the artificial boundaries of human understanding. 1 month after the extraordinary events in Lunaris Grove, St. Cassian's Basilica hummed with a new kind of energy. The ancient church had been transformed, its medieval architecture now housing a unique blend of spiritual sanctuary and cutting-edge research facility. The Elena Kavari Institute occupied a newly constructed wing, its quantum computers and research laboratories existing in perfect harmony with the centuries-old sacred space. Meridith stood in what had once been the Basilica's garden, now transformed into a meditation space where scientists and spiritual seekers alike gathered to study the quantum effects of focused consciousness. The roses still bloomed with supernatural vigor, but now their growth patterns were carefully monitored by sensors that recorded the quantum coherence fields generated by prayer and meditation. "The latest results are remarkable," Soren said, approaching with a tablet displaying new data. "The quantum signatures we're recording are consistent across all major faith traditions. It's as if the underlying mathematics of consciousness doesn't care what name we use for God," Meridith finished, smiling. The pendant at her throat pulsed gently, a constant reminder of Elena's presence in the quantum field. Father Ambrose emerged from the Basilica, where he had been leading a unique service that combined traditional prayer with quantum field measurements. "The Vatican's scientific committee is arriving next week," he announced. "They're particularly interested in how the quantum healing effects correlate with historical records of miraculous cures." Dr. Reeves joined them, her medical tablet showing new scans. "It's not just healing anymore. We're seeing accelerated learning, enhanced creativity, even signs of expanded consciousness, all correlating with specific quantum coherence patterns. Elena's theories about consciousness evolution are proving more accurate than we could have imagined. The transformation of Lunaris Grove had extended far beyond St. Cassian's walls. The small town had become a global center for the study of consciousness and quantum reality. Scientists and spiritual leaders from every tradition came to explore the bridge between faith and physics that Elena had discovered. Meridith touched the pendant, feeling the familiar warmth. Elena knew this would happen. Not just the scientific validation, but the way it would transform our understanding of both science and faith. She saw that they were never meant to be separate. The quantum field visible to her now showed complex patterns of interaction between the consciousness of those gathered in meditation and the underlying fabric of reality. What had once seemed impossible to her scientific mind now appeared obvious. The universe wasn't just conscious, it was consciousness itself expressing through physical form. Ms. Kavari, a young researcher approached, excitement in her voice. The new quantum coherence imaging system is online. Would you like to see? They gathered in the Institute's main laboratory, where a revolutionary device of Meridith's design displayed the conscious quantum field in real time. The display showed something extraordinary, the actual process of prayer creating interference patterns in the fabric of reality, thoughts and intentions manifesting as complex quantum operations. This is what Elena saw, Meridith whispered. Not with instruments, but with direct perception. The mathematics wasn't just describing reality, it was revealing the thoughts of God. The evening bells began to toll, and the quantum display erupted with harmonic patterns. Each toll created ripples in the consciousness field, amplified by the collective awareness of those gathered in prayer. Science and faith, once thought incompatible, now danced together in perfect mathematical harmony. Vesper Quinn, who had expanded her cafe into a gathering place for visiting researchers and spiritual seekers, arrived with fresh bread and tea. Sometimes, she said wisely, it takes a skeptic to prove a miracle. Your challenge to God didn't just change you, Ms. Kavari. It changed all of us. As the sun set over Lunaris Grove, casting its light through the Basilica's quantum-monitored stained glass, Meridith stood in the spot where she had first issued her challenge. The world had changed in ways she could never have predicted. Her $50 million challenge had evolved into billions in research funding, as the world recognized the importance of what Elena had discovered. The real miracle, she said to the gathered group, wasn't proving God's existence. It was discovering that science and faith are both essential for understanding the full spectrum of reality. Elena knew that. Now we all do. In the quantum field visible around them, equations danced like living things, consciousness flowed like water, and the boundary between observer and observed dissolved into unity. The challenge that began as a skeptic's demand for proof had become a doorway to a new understanding of existence itself. The pendant pulsed one final time as darkness fell, and in its light, Meridith saw the future Elena had glimpsed. A world where science and faith worked together to explore the infinite mysteries of conscious reality, each illuminating what the other could not fully grasp alone. And in Lunaris Grove, where an atheist millionaire had once challenged God, heaven and earth had finally met. Not in conflict, but in the perfect harmony of quantum mathematics and divine love, just as Elena had always known they would. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.